Welcome back, Intro to Literature class. This video is going to be mostly a response to some discussion posts on the Justin Kurzel film version of Macbeth from 2015, and some observations that I'm just going to fill in that I made about the film itself. Before I get there, I just want to hit a few things that just to remind people who are in the actual section of the class and not just following along on YouTube or something like that, which is fine. You're welcome to do that. uh, I sent a midterm assignment last week and a midterm video explaining the assignment, and I gave you multiple options for the assignment as well. If you go into content, you will see the assignment handout, also the handout on fiction terms or the elements of fiction, and the short stories that you can choose 3 from. The short stories are, I'm just going to list them here if anybody's following along online. Chinua Achebe's Dead Man's Path, James Baldwin's Sonny's Blues, Jorge Luis Borges. This is Garden of the Forking Paths. James Joyce's The Dead, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings, Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried, Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find, Leslie Marmon's Silko, The Man to Send Rain Clouds, and Alice Walker, Everyday Use. And I say people should just try and read 3 of those stories. They're easy to find as PDFs if you're following along on YouTube or something. That they're easy to find online if you just Google the names of them. And I just suggest that people mix up the gender. So don't just read like 3 men's stories or 3 women's stories. Just mix it up a little bit. If you want, they're all great stories. I just can't assign everything. So I'm giving options. There was a second option in the midterm exam, which is to read James Baldwin's Letter from a Region Inside My Mind. There's a link to that in Blackboard if you're in the class, or you can Google it. You can see it at the newyorker.com. They have a version of that. It's also in the book The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. And I suggest that you compare that letter, which was composed in 1962. It was published. I'm comparing it to the recent events and protests surrounding the movement for Black Lives, which if you don't know, if the writer Ta-Nehisi Coates, who wrote a really famous book a few years ago called Between the World and Me, if you haven't read that, it also operates as a letter, and it's kind of operating in this tradition of letter writing material, and so is so arguably influenced by James Baldwin's Letter from a Region Inside My Mind. I also think that people, maybe if you don't know it, you should check out the Nas, the rapper Nas, Nas, from his album Illmatic, which is a classic hip hop album, particularly the song "The World Is Yours." Those are there are lots of other songs. There are lots of other things, but I feel like some of the things that Nas is talking about, it's a good little linear trajectory to go through, kind of working and comparing through those 3 texts. And then the third option was to deal with Macbeth in the midterm, right? And there's lots of ways to deal with Macbeth, and I'm going to go ahead and jump into an analysis of the video. You can see me in office hours or shoot me an email if you have questions on the midterm assignment. But just remember, there's no official discussion post this week. I want you to focus on writing your midterm paper. And I made the due date I gave you a little bit more time. I made it due next Sunday, July 5th by midnight, and that was just to make it so nothing was due on the actual day of the holiday. If you are partying with people, try to remember social distancing and being safe about that kind of stuff, because there's big increase in cases for the pandemic this week. unfortunately, not just in the US, but around the world. So, okay, enough of that. Here we go. Some things I wanted to point out to you about Justin Kurzel's film. So, this came up in your posts about that going from a book to a movie is always tricky or is always controversial. I don't really think so in this case. I mean, I'm sure that there can be controversial screenings or adaptations of Shakespeare's plays, but we have to remember that in this section of the class, we're dealing with drama, and drama is meant for the stage. So there's a flexibility built into the structure of the text that allows some choices to be made by the company or the acting troupe or the director who is putting on the play. And there's that kind of flexibility. And some things are not as flexible. And one of the questions that I've been having us think through with Macbeth is the balance between whether or not it is a pagan play or a Christian play. This is something that I didn't just come up with this. This is just like some scholars weigh those in the balance because it allows us to tease out a lot of things in the play. It also allows us to attend to some of the historical circumstances surrounding the play. And there was some confusion. It's not really like, I mean, I know people like, you know, will complain about the book being better than the movie and stuff like that in the reader's imagination. But it's important to remember that drama is literature and it's not just read silently. It transfers across mediums. So we have to expand our concept of literature maybe a little bit. Now, this, of course, people read literature silently as well, but even in the play, you will note that Lady Macbeth is reads Macbeth's letter aloud in the play. And that you could think like, oh, that's just a way of showing the audience what is going on. But it's actually like the way people used to read was to read out loud and to read silently as people started to do that more and more as English culture and just sort of European culture became more reading centered. And this is especially after the printing press and William Caxton and the 1400s and so you're getting a slow media revolution in the 1500s 1600s where there's a lot of shift to a text-based culture. And what I mean by that is that we still live in a document-centered culture. We worry about your papers. Do you have your license? We print money still, which is writing on paper, right? It's like particular kind of writing that signifies this stuff, value. But passports, document status for citizenship, all of that. We live our little corner of human culture by these documents. And that is certainly a recent thing in human culture. And so we know in Chaucer, for example, who's a Middle English poet, that some of the characters in the Canterbury Tales, I believe, I'm trying to think of which character it is. They comment on a character who is very weird because he looks at books and, or maybe it's Chaucer himself. I'm confusing the story here. That it's somebody who was commenting on Chaucer that he looked at books silently but didn't read out loud, and so it just meant that he was reading silently. But the fact that it was remarkable to people who saw him doing it. Um, uh, sort of shows a way that people read or thought of reading in culture, and that makes sense because like we've seen like an oral shift from oral culture to written culture, and so keep that in mind when we're thinking about adaptation of plays. And then also just I would think that we should kind of keep in check a flat-footed kind of tendency to just assume that like the book is always better than the movie or something. And certainly that can be the case, and our reading imaginations are different than other people's interpretations. But what is more interesting to talk about in terms of our class is what is with the definition of literature being the way that we track social desire over time. Well, if we see an adaptation of a text, or we see the way a text is being alluded to or showing up in another text, it gives us something to talk about in terms of the perspective or the interpretation that's being brought to the text, and that is more important maybe than thinking that a text exists in a kind of purified state somewhere. Which is actually kind of a religious idea if you think about it, right? So people for example, devout Muslims who don't believe that the Quran should be translated out of Arabic. It loses its holy status if it is done so. People who believe in something like the inerrancy of biblical scriptures, they have this idealized version of the text. We know that's not how the text was put together, or even written to begin with historically. And so those of us who study literature or the materiality of texts have a very different experience than people who are treating texts as some sort of like purified, unblemished sort of thing. Of course, whenever you're reading biblical texts, if you're reading it in English, you're reading it through multiple linguistic translations, right? Unless you know your Aramaic and your Greek and your Hebrew pretty well, you're not going to be getting something in its direct form. Okay, so let's pop over to the film. The film and this question of the balance between Christianity and paganism. And we know that Shakespeare does this on purpose to a certain extent. He sets his play on purpose in pre-Christian times, and because of that, he gets away with putting all sorts of stuff on stage that would otherwise be taboo, like witches' Sabbath ceremonies, right? And you hear that term Sabbath, right? The holy day, and that's a kind of an anti-Semitic notion that is part of the period where the witches are being associated with Sabbath, or the whole Jewish holy day, which would be Saturday. And so Saturday night and like the whole witches party, and this is the Christians were sort of condensing their intolerance for Jewish people and their intolerance for pagans together. So we have the right away, and no one really. Someone mentioned Macbeth's child in their post, but nobody really talked about this opening scene, which just immediately shows us like a big interpretive element from Justin Kurzel's point of view, which is that the film opens on the funeral of a child, and it appears to be Macbeth and Lady Macbeth's child. Now we know in the play, if we read the play, that Lady Macbeth talks about knowing what it's like to give suck to a child, but there's no child of theirs that appears in the actual text of the play. And so to open not only with a child in the play, but on its funeral, it's giving us a lot of kind of backstory to Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. And that's what I kind of want to make a little bit of an argument for, is that Kurzel's film paints Macbeth and Lady Macbeth in probably a much more sympathetic light than I did when I walked through the text last week. And so we get this funeral, and there's no words being spoken, right? It's just the images that are telling us all this. And then we get the weird sisters, and they're looking at the funeral scene, and they are commenting in those famous opening lines of the play. In Kurzel's version, they're commenting kind of on the funeral itself. And then when they ask, like, when shall we meet again, they're kind of projecting into the future of the battlefield, which is where the actual play is kind of starting when we read it. Another interesting thing that some of you noticed is that in addition to the three sisters, there's a little girl witch who doesn't really say anything, but has some movements and attaches things to touches Macbeth and other characters. So there's this strange physical element. As I read the movie, and this is just my reading, but many of you noticed that Hecate doesn't show up. The Hecate parts of the play are cut out of the dialogue for the Kurzel films, though good for you for noticing that. I almost wonder if, like, they're embodying Hecate as the little girl, even though she doesn't really say anything. In the That's just an interesting thought that occurred to me. Um, the Weird Sisters are not portrayed in the film as particularly wicked. Not nearly as wicked as I was reading them last week as I read along the play in my videos. They look pained when they're talking, almost traumatized. There isn't a ton of feeling in their voices, but it's very quiet. It's not like they're delighting. And those scenes where the witches delight in the play seem to delight in just like causing havoc. That doesn't seem to be the way that Kurzel wants to portray it. We get red filters, dark clouds, reds and blacks. These are the colors of the Macbeth play themselves, but they become so much more apparent in the way that Kurzel has used these filters on all of the grays. I mean, if you've been to Scotland, it is often gray up there. If you've been to Glasgow, it's a very dark feeling town. If you've been to Edinburgh, it's a little bit more posh and kind of rich town. Um, uh, but Glasgow or Glaswegians or Ouijies, as they refer to themselves as, there can be a kind of darkness. There are definitely a dark humor in Ouija culture. My Ouija friends, if you're seeing this. Um, uh, um, so red filters, dark clouds, just darkness all around. And there's just a lot of attention to, as people notice, to the war scenes, to battle scenes, slow motion, fast motion, and the imagery really kind of sometimes looks like medieval tapestries. I think that's something really gorgeous that Justin Kurzel has done in the version of his version of the play. And then we see Macbeth is wrapping a sword onto a young soldier's hand, and that young soldier is going to show up throughout the play. Shows up as a ghost later on in the play, right? And part of what he's doing, like you see, all of the troops are being portrayed as young, and very scared kids, and that's kind of in some ways historically accurate. I mean, Macbeth is looks like he's like late 30s or early 40s, like maybe even like my age, and that's like old. You're like an old dude. But I don't feel like I'm that old today, but definitely back then you're kind of an old dude, if you've made it that far. And so these young guys are scared. They're defending their land, and they don't all know how to use swords really well, and so that they don't lose their sword, Macbeth is um, wrapping it around the young boy's hand. Then we get the Weird Sisters showing up on the battlefield in the midst of things. Like when we get it, it's apparently Macbeth is seeing them on the battlefield, so that's pretty interesting. Uh, um, we see on screen the previous Thane of Cawdor appearing and his execution on the screen, right? So, but in the play, that Thane does not appear before Duncan, and this is something that Kurzel does a lot in his plays. That uh, Kurzel has this technique of using a character, showing them before another character, and it changes the context of, in this case, Duncan's words, because he's speaking to the traitorous Cawdor, and then takes literally sort of, like takes the mantle and says that it will go to Macbeth, and then they show Cawdor's execution. Uh, we cut back to the end of the battle scene, and Macbeth is now standing over the dead child soldier, and he and Banquo are moving dead bodies around, and this is where we get so fair and foul a day I have not seen, right? And so that's pretty interesting there. A couple of other things, and some of you noticed this in your responses, so good job if you did. Um, uh, uh, Justin Kurzel's version really um, does a lot with Christian imagery. So when we pop over and we see Lady Macbeth, reading, it's quite interesting because she's not. She seems to be like reading cloth or something. It's she's not reading. She doesn't have a letter in her hand, and so there's a sense that maybe there's been something woven, but it's like it wouldn't be that quick, to weave a whole story. So there's just it's interesting, and she's in a church praying on her knees, right? Um, and even so, it Kurzel kind of the uh, screenwriters have sort of cut up the lines from different contexts and repieced them together. But even those famous words where she's saying "come" 3 times, right? And she seems to be calling on all of the dark forces. She's looking up at um, at a Christian altar, right? And it's a definitely a northern, like a Scottish version of this, and so you might have some of the earlier pagan culture around it, but it's very clear that the cross is the central image in the particular context, right? And so that's really really interesting. So she and there's crosses at the graveyard too, so that we see a graveyard outside of the church before we go into the church where she's praying. And so that seems to be setting us in this kind of time where Christianity seems to be new to Scotland. So it's still historic. The ways that these people are dressed as kings, they don't have like really really fancy clothes even all the time. Duncan's kind of like moving around in a tent. Remember to my earlier lectures, like that it wasn't necessarily a blood lineage. So at the time, which is why Macbeth got to become king anyway, even though Duncan announces that Malcolm will be the next king in line. But the way that's just another scene, right? Like the Kurzel does that. He shows that announcement that Duncan's making with Macbeth in the room, and then Macbeth, it goes into his imagination, like he's sort of meditating on his own ambition at that point, after Duncan has sort of put this chair up on the table in the middle of the tent, right? Uh, when they get back, when the child Fleance greets Banquo, and so we see a lot of children actually in the film itself, right? And Fleance, we know, of course, is actually in the play as well. And so we're getting a little bit more of a commentary now. Some of you mentioned in your posts, like one person mentioned that there's a lot of biblical scripture being in the play's text itself, and I asked you to write to me and see, and like what lines specifically, where do you see um, text being pulled from scripture and being used directly in this text. And I already said in my earlier lecture, of course, like Shakespeare would not be using the King James Bible. It wasn't even done yet by the time the play came out, and he used different versions um, of 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 different English translations of Bibles. Sometimes the Geneva Bible, which was a very popular Bible during the time period. Um, but if you see that, I would like to see what you're seeing. Um, Not so much in terms of direct citation of scripture. What seems to be hovering about this, and I didn't talk about this too much in my earlier lectures, is the story of Herod, the king who, biblical king who says that all children need to. He's worried that um, he's going to be deposed by a child, and so he orders all of the children in the realm to be murdered. Right, and so that seems to be coupled with Macbeth. I think there's a lot of imagery, and if you're doing your midterm and you wanted to look up the Herod story and make comparisons between that and Macbeth, that might be a really nice little comparison paper. Um, and so then at first, if I go back to Lady Macbeth's kind of first speech here, it skips the lines about the milk of human kindness in the initial soliloquy of Lady Macbeth, and then those lines show up again uh, when Macbeth shows up in front of her, so that she's actually giving him this advice, like I worry that you have too much of the milk of human kindness. So that's interesting, cutting up and rearranging that is being done with the script. The children singing in Kurzel's play version, and it would be worth doing some research on the song, the old Scottish song that they are singing in the text of the song, because that doesn't show up in the play at all. And those children that, like, that there are these children, and Lady Macbeth is right behind them singing with them as well, right? And uh, it's like, these are just kind of children from uh, from the Dunsinane, from Macbeth's castle around, like, it's a very strange moment, the way that they associate her with the children. And then just after that scene, Duncan names Malcolm Cumberland, or is the prince who's going to become the next king. And then immediately there's a montage, and so this is like one of the techniques that film can do that we can't get from play acting on stage, where we get these montages of memory, of thought, of ambition, this pondering that goes on in Macbeth's head as he's deliberating what to do after this is his reaction to Malcolm being named the next king. Then we get Lady Macbeth and Macbeth together, kind of having this argument in the church about whether or not they're going to go through with it. And as frequently happens in productions of Macbeth, there's tons of sexual energy in Enmeshed, and we get again montages to other things happening at the same time. But they're making out and they start having sex, and as Macbeth climaxes and finishes, that's when he says that he's set his mind to it. So it really is this literal kind of seduction scene that happens with Lady Macbeth, and he sets his mind to his task. A very interesting, and then inside of the church too, which is all sorts of imagery there for you. Banquo and Fleance then they show up again, and like they're kind of set up as a parallel of like a father and a son, but then Macbeth kind of as the parallel to that keeps pondering the boy from the battle. Now it doesn't appear, and it doesn't even appear in, like, if you look up in imdb.com, like internet music database, they don't name the young soldier in the battle as Macbeth's son, but the baby in the beginning, who is portrayed as a son, is named Macbeth's child. But there is this kind of like strange ghostly relationship between Macbeth and the young soldier who's killed that kind of looks like father and son. And that soldier shows up again, and at this moment in the play when the floating dagger, this famous floating dagger scene shows up. But the way that Kurzel has done it is that this boy soldier who has come back to life is the one who is holding the dagger, and so Macbeth is literally talking to a ghost at this point. We see the murder of Duncan on stage in Kurzel's version. That does not happen on stage in Shakespeare's version of the text. Also, then immediately after a brutal slaying of Duncan, Macbeth lays down in bed next to the dead king, and we get a shot that switches over to the horses who are breaking their bridles. And remember, in the play, the horses actually eat each other in the play, and that's nicely sort of connected to the killing of the king. Um, and then we see Malcolm, and like Donalbain doesn't really show up in the film version here, so I kind of think of like Kurzel kind of combined Malcolm and Donalbain, Duncan's sons, in the text, but we see Malcolm showing up in the middle of the night at the king's tent, and here's Macbeth in there, and Macbeth kind of makes this excuse to him, about like that he's, out of rage killed the people who already killed him, and immediately Malcolm sort of takes off. We see that Lady Macbeth sees him taking off, but this does not happen in that kind of a sequence in the film itself, right? Um, or sorry, in the play, the original play, Malcolm does not find out until the morning. And in the morning, Malcolm has already fled, right? He's gone off to England. In the play, of course, Donalbain goes to Ireland, and they meet up later on. But in the morning, we only get Macduff. Um, uh, we we get the church. In the church is the washing of the hands scene, where Macbeth is kind of, you know, contemplating his recent action, and where Lady Macbeth shows up too, again. So then in the morning, of course, like I just said, we only get Macduff at the death scene. And then we get a Christian funeral again. So the second funeral showing up, and we get the king's funeral. And at this Christian funeral for Duncan in the church, we get the talk of Lennox and the Lord, right? The commentary from the kind of upper classes perspective, and they're not sure whether or not it's going to be right to follow Macbeth. Um, Banquo and Fleance, again, lots of images of them together. The coronation scene. Banquo all seems to know. They portray him as suspicious, and I think that, like, I mean, most people are pretty, apt to read that into to Banquo's character. And then in the play, of course, remember, Macbeth says it himself, that like he comments on how skilled Banquo is at keeping his mouth shut when it is necessary to do so. Again, kind of references to Herod showing up, and especially like he in one of his fits, Macbeth holds a knife to Lady Macbeth, to her body, and so there's this kind of shift in image. Like, remember, it's like it is still very sexualized imagery, but they had already had sex, and now he's actually holding a weapon to her belly, and at right below her crucifix. So she's wearing her crucifix. So that sexual imagery that is turned to violence, and sort of combined with the religious imagery, is going on, interestingly, in the film. And this is where he's sort of complaining about, I've done all of this only for them, right? Only to them, or like the seed of Banquo. Like, why have I even done this? And the famous line where he says, like, things are set in motion, and we see this moment where Lady Macbeth, of course, like, shifts. She's not aware of all of Macbeth's plans, and where he says, be innocent, dearest Chuck, don't you worry about it, little lady, or something like I've got things under control. And clearly, he at this point reaches underneath Lady Macbeth's dress and talks about having an invisible hand, and she is both appears to be scared and sexually aroused, at the same time, but sort of at the end of the scene feels kind of repulsed. So there's this very creepy, like violation imagery going on in Kurzel's version here. Um, Fleance, we get the murder scene happening with Banquo in the woods, and Fleance flees, but she sees the young child of the weird girl, that fourth weird sister, and so the film attributes kind of the weird sisters as casting a kind of glamour onto the scene and helping Fleance escape. Um, Macbeth is a mess at the feast. Um, and we also see weird sisters who are suckling a child at this point. So it's just like weird stuff thrown in there that's not really part of the play. And always around child imagery. Um, there's the dead child warrior has shown up as a ghost. Uh, Later on in the play or in the film, Macbeth burns Macduff's wife and children, and it looks like a witch trial scene. I mean, that's like all of the burning stuff is just conjures. That's the right word, I guess. There conjures the idea of a witch trial, and this seems to like Lady Macbeth is visibly disturbed at like this moment of seeing the public as execution of another lady at the hands of her husband, and she goes back to the church again, and she's kind of this is her downward spiral, right? There's not much equivocator stuff really going on in the film version of the play, and remember that was a big part of the context for King James I after the gunpowder plot tried to blow up Parliament in the early 1600s, before as the play was kind of being written. There's also like some pretty interesting in the play. Macbeth's servant's name is Satan, like Seyton, but it's pronounced Satan, and Kurzel doesn't actually have him present in the church. Even though, so Macbeth calls out to him, but he's in the church, and it sounds like, of course, sounds like he's calling to Satan. Um, uh, um, there's a lot of burning woods, the burning of the woods that show up instead of just like soldiers cutting up the woods and using them as camouflage. The way that the woods come to Dunsinane, Burnham Wood, is through smoke and ash. Um, uh, and yet, nevertheless, the version seems sympathetic, I believe, to Macbeth. And so, why do I think it's sympathetic? Well, I think that it's sympathetic because it opens with the death and the funeral of a child, and the loss of two parents. And so we see Macbeth as this warrior out in the field of battle, doing his duty, but also like with a kind of rage and a kind of that that sentiment that shows up, like that tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow, right? That it's like it's a the story told by an idiot, sound of fury signifying nothing, right? And that, even though that happens later on in the play, I feel like you're getting this as a kind of static character that throughout that Macbeth has no way to pass on his lineage, and he is this warrior who was never really like supposed to necessarily be the king. And that's kind of an interesting crux, I think, of the religious imagery going on. If we go back to really old, like ancient texts, like not Christian texts, like the Rig Veda from India, and where they talk about kings and warriors, and the kings are kind of the Brahmin, the priests, and then there's the Kishtaras, um, who are the warriors. And so you get like the warrior versus the king, or the warrior versus the priest, and sometimes you get it showing up as the priest or the church and the king and the military kind of showing up, these different institutions of human culture showing up, but they're very much muddied. Like the question seems to be is like whether or not, like the greatest warrior ought to be, or is fit to be king. It's a question that will come up in another play that Shakespeare writes a few years later called Coriolanus, which is it's a historical play on a figure in Rome, Coriolanus. And so it's definitely something that Shakespeare is thinking about, is like who is fit to be in power, who is fit to be leader, and who is going to become a tyrant. And of course, Macbeth is the tyrant in the play. And yet we see, because there's so much imagery that is like devoted to this situation of being deprived from the beginning, there are ways, I think that there's ways to be more sympathetic to the characters in Kurzel's version of the text as well. And there's probably some good thought work to be done there. I'm not going to speculate in this particular lecture right now, but just sort of throwing out some of the things that were going on in Scotland as the film is being made. And so you might remember back a few years ago questions about the Scottish referendum and whether they were going to break away from England. This is a few years before what we now call Brexit, right? So Brexit changed everything, and it's a really different political consciousness after Brexit, not just in England, but around the world a few years ago. But and then there's questions about whether or not the Scottish referendum is going to be back on the table, and that's fine. That's contemporary politics, but at least as situating what's going on in the film itself, how is it commenting on Scotland, the nation? How is it commenting on youth and kings and who should be leaders? Is there something of a contemporary political nature going on in Kurzel's version? And I think that's where critical work could definitely be done. And surely some people have written stuff if you wanted to research more into that in a paper, and that's exactly why I'm not going more into it right now, because you might have an opportunity in your final paper which requires some research to do some of that, and I just don't want to speculate too much. I want you guys to be able to try to do critical work yourself. Just because I think this film version of the play is sympathetic to a certain extent to Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, I do not see them as being portrayed as in any redemptive or Christian way. And many of you commented on this in your posts as well. We see at the end of the film version, of course, Fleance taking off with a sword and running off into the and one of you mentioned that in your post, and yes, so we see that the cycle of the battle, the cycle of the Game of Thrones, as we might call it, is going to continue from with Fleance and Malcolm. At least that seems to be what's happening in the film. And of course, if you ever had time, you might look back at the early 70s. The Roman Polanski, famous director of Rosemary's Baby, has a version that seems to speak to that kind of pagan-ish continued cycle of violence. Yes, there might be moments of peace followed by just like the turning of fortune's wheel, right? Or from my earlier lectures as well. This doesn't mean that there might not be ways to read the play as Christian, the film as Christian, and I would be interested to hear your arguments if you did see that. But quite interestingly, very, very much playing against Christian imagery in the film. So, and I wonder sometimes if that is a way of conceiving ancient Scotland, maybe versus England in certain ways, to think about um, that, Christianity being associated with English, so-called civilization narratives, and that there might be a way of sort of looking at, if the film is commenting on something contemporary politically going on, in terms of Scotland as its own country, apart from England. I wonder if there's ways of looking into what the film is doing with religious imagery there. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. That's just interesting stuff to think about. Uh, um, we'll carry on this week. There's no discussion post to do because you're all writing papers, and you're choosing one of the options for your midterm, either the short stories, the creative nonfiction, which would be the James Baldwin Letter from a Region Inside My Mind, or you're doing something with Macbeth. Whichever option you choose, it's up to you, and you have the parameters for that in your assignment sheet. I'll be in office hours on Monday as usual, or you can shoot me an email. Have a good night, and thanks for all of your work so far this semester. I'm really enjoying your posts, especially your engagement with one another. That's crucial, that you guys talk to each other, and that you don't just talk or listen to me. Literature is meant to be talked, to be discussed with each other out loud. Sometimes it's a little bit lonely making these videos in my little apartment during COVID time. So feel free to reach out to me because I'm happy to talk about this stuff in person. Okay, take care and have a good day.